So last time was all about trying to break down what went wrong with a session in order to, figure out how to improve on it. And this time it went really well. So I need to do a little bit of a campaign diary and breakdown to figure out what went well so that I can replicate that. So at the end of this last session, my players were super stoked. They had a great time and they expressed that, and they just very directly were like, "Yep, that was a great session." One of my players was like, "That was one of like the coolest combat encounters that I've done," even though he didn't like land any shots, I think, during the whole encounter. So I'm gonna be breaking that down and trying to figure out like what went so much better about this session. I think the first thing, just right off the bat, there was two and then like a couple partial combat encounters, which is great. That's getting closer to my goal of like 2 or 3 per session, which I think is important just because like combat is fun and it's cool. And I think my players in particular, they get a kick out of that and they like the lateral thinking of trying to work their way through a combat encounter. So because they had more of that this session, I think they were happier just in general, and they were still enjoying like the other non-combat role-playing type of stuff. So the combat encounters they had first was against some boggarts, and like I had mentioned, they've uh, been getting stalked by boggarts for a few hours now, and because of that, their AC was very low. And this combat encounter pretty much worked out just how I wanted it to. It wasn't a huge threat to them, but it was very scary because their AC was so low and they were getting hit pretty much every time. There was not any misses, I don't think, on the part of the boggarts. Maybe one. And that was great. It meant that it had the effect that it wanted, and they thought it was kind of cool that there was like one boggart assigned to each of them, so that when that boggart died, they would get their AC back. And I didn't really have this planned out ahead of time, but intuitively during the battle, I realized that if a boggart is locked onto someone and this is like your target, I think they would go for that person even if they were knocked unconscious. I think that would make the situation like way more tense, right? So this is the only time so far, I think this even includes my last campaign, where a player was unconscious and I still had the monster attack them, which is risky. Okay, I'm usually not looking to kill PCs. And that, I mean, that's not my goal or anything. I'm not like a mean DM or anything. And I think it would kind of bum everybody out in that situation because it wasn't like a super meaningful fight. But I made a call and I was like, no, if they've targeted this one player, they're going to keep going after them even if they've dropped unconscious. So I had that happen, and my player was at -9 HP when his max HP was 10. So he was 1 hit point away from death, and with the lowered AC, the chance of him getting hit was very, very high. Now there was a cool moment where my players had all like moved themselves in between basically his unconscious body and the boggart. So when the boggart went for him, I was like, well, I looked at the situation and I was like, well, he wants you. So he went to go for it, and I was worried because I was like, well, I guess his PC's gonna die. But then I realized, like, no, you guys are basically standing between him and the fallen dancers, so you guys are going to get opportunity attacks, and that was able to do it. So it was really cool. I think it felt very tense for them, and the mechanic worked, and the boggart wasn't like overly complicated. So it was just very straightforward. Like, you have lowered AC and you're taking damage. This is very scary, and that was just enough. There didn't need to be a whole lot of other like extra stuff. They have another ability where if they're close to an enemy, then their enemy will get disadvantage on all saving throws except for intelligence and wisdom. It's called unlucky, and I would assume that your intelligence and your wisdom would be unaffected if you were unlucky, but everything else would. That didn't really come into play. It did later though, so so they did that. They wanted to go back to this party that they had encountered earlier, like an actual party, like a bonfire that they were gonna set up. So they hung out and they had like a social interaction with some goblins, which was kind of neat. I got to see like how they would be reacting in a social situation like that. And that's where I had one of my half combat encounters. Well, both of them actually. So one of them happened first when they decided to take some goblin drink, and the goblin drink, of course, made them pass out immediately and start having a shared dream where they fought a big fiery serpent. And it wasn't a combat encounter, but it was like a very goofy combat encounter because my players weren't taking it seriously. They were just like, I'm going to start playing music for the snake or whatever. But then like one of them actually said like, I'm gonna roll investigation, and when he got a good investigation roll, I said, you know, you're in a dream, so you can do whatever. He like summoned a giant mech to fight the snake and stuff, and I was like, well, how much HP does it have? Like I basically just like gave him the call and all of that. When he like attacked, I was like, how much damage do you do? Like I just asked him instead of having him roll for stuff. And because you're in a dream, you can do whatever you want, but just because they did it, I just gave them enough XP to get to level 2 because I needed them to be at level 2. And meanwhile, only a few players actually accepted the drink that they were offered. A couple of them stayed conscious in the realm of the living, and the Goliath Ranger is one of the main character traits that he's trying to emphasize with her character, with the character of the Goliath, is that she is very competitive. So she goes for any opportunity she can to get in a competition, and she ended up wrestling a Boggart Brute, and which was fun because aside from just being like a big meathead, the Boggart Brute has the same unlucky ability as the regular Boggarts. So in this case, when you're doing a wrestling match and you have characters trying to grapple each other, doing strength checks and stuff like that, the fact that he was going to be getting disadvantage played into it a lot more. Now that I think about it, actually right now while I'm doing this, I realize that like checks and saves are different, and probably a lot of the things that he was doing were actually checks that I still gave him disadvantage on. But that's all up in there. I don't even remember. I think there were some things that I didn't give him disadvantage on, and some things that I did, depending on. I think if it was a save or a check. But I just recently realized that there's a difference between those things. I'm not super, like I said, I'm not super literate with the rules, but I'm doing my best. And I guess a save and a check are different. So him trying to grapple the Boggart Brute would not necessarily give him disadvantage with the way I wrote the stat block, but him trying to escape or resist the Boggart trying to grapple him would be. So that's just a little thing that I'm just now realizing I did kind of weird, but whatever. It's not like the players knew. And he still managed to get a nice little wrestling match going, and he won. And through all that stuff, my players leveled up. So those were like the two half combat encounters, was the dream encounter and the wrestling match, which both kind of used combat mechanics, but they didn't have like the same stakes as like a normal combat encounter. So they were all excited about that. They still have this goal of getting to Scrimley's Hollow, and they still have not accomplished it just because stuff keeps getting in the way. I'm not loving how slow it's going, like in-game time-wise. They're only on day 2 now, like early morning, like 2 a.m. on day 2, which I was hoping one of my goals was to try to get them through like a day or two during this session, but it didn't really work out. Hopefully once they're done at Scrimley's Hollow, they can, they'll start doing some overworld travel, and that will eat up a bunch of their time. I'm trying to get the ticking clock thing going so that, their rests are worth a lot, their, time and where they decide to go and how they decide to do things, matters more. And I think that'll count more and more. I think them having to like stack up combat encounters is great because it means that they have to think about their time and like when are we going to take a long rest and stuff like that. At level 2, they all unlocked a lot of really cool stuff, so they were excited to use those. I'm excited that they have those abilities because it's kind of like, every time your PCs level up, it kind of like gives them a little more buy-in of like, ooh, I want to like try this new stuff. Let's get into some combat encounters. Whereas like them being stuck at level 1 for like 2.5 sessions was kind of a lot. And in my last campaign, I did checkpoint XP only, where I would just tell them like, now you level up when I thought it was appropriate. And that was good. I wanted to experiment with actually giving like, XP based on the tasks that they do and like actually having them count XP, which I think has been going okay. Oh, well, there's upside and downside. The upside is that they want to, ask about XP and they're like invested in like trying to get that reward. It's not all going to be like they're intrinsically interested in every single encounter. They're interested in getting some XP, which I think is fine. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with them wanting XP from an encounter rather than like just being inherently interested in everything that they can do. Plus, I've been remembering to just award them XP for non-combat stuff too. So they're not just like murder hobo, like we have to kill everything we see so we can get some XP for it. In fact, if they just like killed like a lone non-hostile goblin by itself, I wouldn't give them XP for that because I'm like, first of all, that's not a challenge. Second of all, it's like, I'm not going to let you game the system like that. So I haven't run into that problem. What I have run into is that goblins don't have a lot of XP, and a lot of the creatures that I made, I kind of based it off of, the stat blocks that I've been working with and that I've been seeing, like the normal goblin stat blocks. So they're not worth a ton of XP. Of course, I can always just make them worth more XP, especially if it's like a bigger challenge, and some of the more challenging creatures do have a larger XP count, and that's one of the ones they ran into in the next combat encounter, the one that they really loved and were excited about at the end of the session, so I'll talk about that. The way this combat encounter was set up is I was thinking before this session, I was like, I would like to throw one of my custom baddies at them, but I was trying to think of a good time to do it because we had the Bogart fight, and I wanted to try to fit in one of my other like goblin baddies, but I didn't want to be the one to keep throwing diversions at them because they have a goal. They're trying to get to Scrimbly's Hollow, and I didn't want to just keep like being the one to distract them. So I wasn't going to give them a random encounter. I wasn't going to interrupt them on their way there. But something fortuitous happened where in their travel back to get to Scrimbly's Hollow, I asked our Artificer player, who wasn't there last time, so he didn't like do the overworld travel like skill checks. So I just asked him like, hey, skill check time, you're going to tell me like what challenge that you guys run into on the way there and how you deal with it, like what skill that you use to overcome that challenge. And luckily, the skill challenge that he came up with on his own was that there was a group of boars that were getting upset by them trying to cross their territory. And the skill he was going to try to use was animal handling to get them to, calm down so they could pass by safely. And he rolled a nat 1. So they did get to have another combat encounter. I was just like, okay, roll initiative. And it was very just on the fly. Like I didn't have like a boar stat block plan. I could have just looked it up in the monster manual because I'm pretty sure there's a stat block in like the back where it has like all those like just animals and stuff. But I was like, I didn't bother. I was just like, okay, they've got 10 AC, 10 HP or whatever I decided on, and they do this much damage. Like I just made it up on the fly, and it was fine, but it wasn't really a challenge. Maybe draining like a little bit of resources from them, but it wasn't like a real threat. They weren't outnumbered. It was a 5v5. I just rolled a d6 to see how many there were. And then I was like, you know what? Since we're just in combat anyway, I'm going to make this more interesting. So I decided to pull out one of my stat block cards on on my side of the screen, and I was just like, yeah, I could do one of these guys. So I threw a badger goblin at them. Now, as a reminder, the way that the goblin lore works, they can mix with like any creature if they ingest the blood of that creature before they mate. So the badger goblin is just like this big honking dude who he's much larger than a normal goblin, and he's much larger than a normal badger. He's just like taken a badger to its just extreme of just being like a big tanky dude, and it's really exciting. It's a very cool little monster, kind of like a brute, but it has a twist to it that my players loved. So anyway, the way that I set this up is I was like, okay, at the beginning of this round, one of the boars just gets, it's like foot falls into a hole and it gets dragged into that hole, like kicking and squealing and stuff like that. And they're like, oh my gosh, there's a whole nother threat here. And I like drew the little like hole on the mat. And I said, okay, now you're dealing with a badger goblin. And they were like, what the heck is that? So it comes out, and there's a couple of them right there by the hole, and he takes a swing at one of them with his big like root club and misses, but they're like, oh my gosh, this guy means business. And then they they're doing combat. They find out that he has a resistance to slashing damage. It was cool because the fighter was using his greatsword at the time, so he when he swings, I just described it as like he feels the blade like kind of catch on the thick hide of the badger, and it only does half damage. Which is cool. I like that idea of having like because sometimes you have like physical resistance, but they have all three: piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning. And I've been experimenting with like, what if he just has resistance to slashing damage? Because I think a badger, just with like his thick hide and stuff, he would have resistance to slashing. It doesn't make a ton of sense that he would have resistance to bludgeoning and or piercing. So I'm just like, all right, slashing, resistance, boom. And that allowed him to tank a couple of hits pretty well and last a lot longer in the fight, even though the other badgers were the other boars were dispatched like really quickly. So it quickly became like a 5v1, but it was still a cool fight. So there's like two of them on him. He runs around to get into position where two of them are kind of lined up together, and he opens his mouth and a beam of blue light just shoots out through both of the players, and they have to make a constitution check to take half damage from this like big radiant damage blast that came out of this badger. And they were just like, what the heck? Like, it was just such out of left field, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to have this badger goblin that seemed like a very straightforward creature, but then give it some like gnarly ability. So this thing can just like shoot a big hyper beam out of its mouth, and it just comes out of nowhere, and they're just like, holy heck, like what are we gonna do about this? And it makes it just like turns the whole combat encounter on its head, and they're all like, oh my gosh, this is not what we were expecting. So that was super fun. And I had made a couple of tweaks to the Badger Goblin stat block that day in preparation for the session, and it was really good that I did. The first tweak that I made was that I saw that it said 3d8 damage for the Radiant Blast, and I was like, that's too much. We're not doing that, especially if they're going to encounter it today at level 1 or 2. We're not doing that. So I dropped it down to 2d8, which was very smart, and then I changed it, I nerfed it further and said that he needed to charge up this attack every other turn. So he could only use this once, and then the next turn he would be charging, but he could still use his club, right? So he could still do a bunch of damage. In fact, the club does more damage if he hits with it. but the Radiant Blast is not an attack roll. He just does it. So there's like the trade off: more damage or just straight up free damage. And I was when I was running it, I was like, man, he's like outnumbered 5-1. This is going to be really lame if he only gets to do his laser beam once, right? Because you want your bad guy to do their cool bad guy thing at least twice, I think, show that it's like a real thing that they can do, and that it's not just like they do it once and they go down, because that feels like underwhelming. So I was really hoping like he'd do this at least twice. And so those were the tweaks that I made, and they worked out really well because it just created so much more tension when he had to do the charge up. If he was just able to just like blast and then do that just like every turn, I think that would not have been as cool, because when they could tell, I was able to narrate like, oh, he opens his mouth and he starts like, you can see like light particles sort of like start gathering like towards his mouth, and that clearly communicated them like he's charging up. Like I said, it was like a hyper beam, like literally from Pokemon. He has to charge up for a turn to do it. And so they knew what was going on, but I also said he's bloodied when he was bloodied, so they knew that he was like getting damaged significantly. So they knew he's close to going down, but they also knew he's really close to just blasting us again, and that does a lot of damage, and it could easily take us out. So it created this really tense situation where, even though it was very stupid to group up in front of this badger, they knew he was almost dead, so they're just like, we're just going to go in and start wheeling on him. So they were all grouped up, even though it was foolish to be, and they all missed. Okay, I had this thing with a pretty high AC, which isn't normally how I make monsters. I usually go drop the AC, up the HP, because hitting is more fun than missing, and I want my players to hit more often, even if they have to hit it more times, because it'll feel better. They'll feel like cooler, and like they're better at what they do. But with this guy, I was like, AC 16, let's just go with it. Boom. And I mean, it feels a little goofy to have your player, like all of your players miss, but it also like really ratcheted up the tension when it was like, oh my gosh, he's like charging up, we're all missing, he missed, okay, you're the last guy, like this is our like last chance to take him out before he's able to blast us again. And then he misses, and everybody's just like, oh no, and they get blasted again. So it was really cool, really intense, but also really simple. Again, it was just like kind of like the Bogart fight. It was not an overcomplicated thing. It was just like, yeah, this thing has a big laser beam and you have to kill it before it shoots again. And eventually they were able to bring it down, but it was just like that AC was like really nasty. And it kind of makes me rethink that, like, okay, well, you don't want them to miss like all the time or anything, but missing actually kind of can have a lot of weight to it when it's like, we have to hit this thing, or we're going to seriously take a beating from this. So that fight ended the session, and they were all super satisfied with it, and I was satisfied with it because they were. And it's good because the fight didn't like take them out, but it did drain them of health and some resources. So it means that they have to do a little more thinking about like their rest and stuff like that, and that's exactly what I wanted. So pretty much most of the stuff I wanted out of the session I got. Didn't quite get them through a whole day, didn't really get them to the next story beat, which is going to the Goblin Warrens, which I have a lot of plans for, but that's okay. I think that what they did do was very satisfying and some good gameplay. So next time, they're for sure going to get to the Goblin Warrens. I think I'm just going to start them like right outside of Scrimbly's Hall. I'm just going to cut straight to you guys are there and like not waste any time with that, because they have taken like 2 sessions trying to get there. So I'm like, you guys are there. What are you doing? They're going to go to the Goblin Warrens. They're going to see Mama Scrimbly and how jacked up she is. I think at this point their intention is, even though I kind of planted a couple of seeds of like, hey, do you guys like really, since none of you are humans, do you really care about, doing this, about like stopping the Brouhaha? I think they're still pretty committed to it. I think they just think it's the right thing to do, which is fine. That's expected from, good aligned PCs. But I kind of want to plant the seeds of like, maybe we can get a schism going, maybe we can get an alliance going. However, I think Mama Scrimbly's stat block is cool enough that I want them to fight her, and then maybe at the end they can start talking to her, which is an option. That's a thing that exists, is like the villain saying like, "Oh, you've defeated me, and now let's talk," or whatever. So we'll look at that. I do want them to actually fight her. I will try to make the combat happen if possible. Which is, I mean, maybe that's a little rare already, but I think they would rather, fight her at some point than to just talk it out. And because, she's got some cool abilities that I think they'll want to see. In fact, I gave her minimum offensive capabilities because her minions are going to be doing a lot of work, and I think that'll be neat. It'll be cool. I'm excited for the next session. This session was good.